Hey guys, Mike here. In this video, I'm going to explain what weapon Asmongold should start with for Monster Hunter. And I know he started with Greatsword, but here's my take on what weapon you should start with if you're new with Monster Hunter. So let's get right into it. There's three major archetypes of weapons. First things first, I would not start with any of the ranged weapons. So light crossbow, heavy crossbow, and bow. And the reason I wouldn't start with these is because in early game, it's going to be a pain in the ass to farm ammo, materials. Yeah, don't use these, but they are very strong. So he started with Greatsword. The thing about Greatsword is the only defensive options is just dodging, and because it's very slow, which I'm sure he already noticed, the thing you can only really do is draw slashes at first until you gain a lot of monster knowledge. Then you can start integrating charges into your sword attacks. And for all intents and purposes, when the monster is enraged, all you can do is draw slashes anyways. The Greatsword's primary method of defense is dodging. All right, next I got Sword and Shield. And Sword and Shield is very nice. It's the most well-rounded weapon. Joecat will probably tell you Sword and Shield is overpowered, and even though he's kind of joking, he is actually kind of right, because Sword and Shield, even though it has low reach, it's one of the fastest weapons out of all the weapons. You can sheath really fast, so you can get access to sprint after you attack. You have access to blunt damage by hitting monsters in the head with the shield. You have access to elemental damage, whereas the Greatsword will not capitalize on elemental damage. And the attacks are very fast. It's very easy to adapt to any situation. Definitely a strong weapon. All right, the next weapon I have here is the Lance. So the Lance is also a very strong weapon in my opinion. Heavily relies on guard for defense. Now the thing about Lance, and its block is the block is the strongest in the game. You can pretty much block every single monster's attack. All right, next we got Switch Axe, and I do not recommend starting with this weapon. It's like a great sword, but harder to use, is the TLDR. We got Longsword. I would not recommend starting with Longsword either. Its gameplay is heavily focused on counters and requires lots of monster knowledge to play effectively. If you want to be miserable and you're a new player, play Longsword. Next we got Gun Lance, and the reason I'm putting it here under the Lance is because it's sort of a variant on the Lance. It still has a shield, but the Lance has gunpowder and shelling capabilities. It's more complicated than the Lance. Insect I do not really recommend as a starting weapon. I kind of put it on the side next to Longsword because its playstyle is pretty different and not really beginner friendly. Hammer's a pretty simple weapon. Has no guarding capabilities like the Lance, so I'm going to put it here under Greatsword. Its main source of damage is blunt damage, so you are always going to be going for the head. Hunting Horn, I would say, is a variant of the Hammer. It mainly focuses on blunt damage, but the Hunting Horn is about playing songs and getting buffs. Next we got Dual Blades. Dual Blades I would put right here. Very fast, like the Sword and Shield, but it has zero guarding capabilities whatsoever, so it has that in common with the Greatsword. So you're just going to be dashing around. Next we got Charge Blade. Charge Blade is basically a sword and shield that once you build enough gauge, it sort of turns into a Greatsword, sort of. Some say Charge Blade is the most complicated weapon in the game. I tend to agree. So out of these options, which would I start with? Well, if I had to pick my top three weapons that I would start with, it would be either Greatsword, Sword and Shield, and Lance. Because I like to think of these three weapons as where all of these weapons below it are derived from. And then, like I said, Longsword and Insect are kind of like very different, and the way they play do not really transfer over to these other weapons. But if I had to nail it down to two, I would take Greatsword out of the equation and I would just leave it at Sword and Shield or Lance. Now, my top decision would be Sword and Shield. And the reason for that is because Lance, while it is extremely effective, like if you pick up Lance as a beginner, you'll be killing monsters incredibly easy. You'll be taking like no damage. But some people tend to say it's boring because you're just poking the monster. There's a certain art, there's a certain satisfaction of just constantly poking the monster and always constantly guarding and just keeping full uptime on the monster. But I feel that Sword and Shield is a little bit more fun because while you can fall back on guarding with your shield, you are primarily going to be dodging attacks by rolling. Sword and Shield will really teach you all the mechanics in Monster Hunter, from blunt damage to slicing damage to dodging to blocking, to utilizing armor skills to make your Sword and Shield adaptable to every situation. It's very fast. It can access elemental damage. It's just a very good all-arounder and very fun to play. So listen to Joecat and switch to Sword and Shield.